When you first look at a mixing board, it can be quite intimidating. So many knobs and buttons and faders. But the truth is, it's modular. And if you learn one channel strip, it just repeats over and over again. So the goal of this lesson is to go down one channel strip on a small mixing board, and then we'll translate that knowledge into the DAW, where it gets a little more complicated, but really it's based on the same idea. So when we look at a channel strip, and you see that the mixing board is based in a set of vertical strips, when you look at a channel strip, the general idea is sound moves from the top to the bottom, in that we have our input section in the very top, and we have the output section in the very bottom with our fader. Now, it's not exactly that way though, and that's the problem, is that we get that concept and we just assume it's right. But there are some places where the signal flow isn't quite top to bottom, and we'll talk about them as we get there. So in a mixing board, at the very top of the channel strip, you have your input section, and this is very much like what we saw in the audio interface. We have an XLR input for a mic input, and we have a line input for a line level source. And luckily on this mixing board, it does say that it's balanced or unbalanced, so it could take a TRS or a TS cable. Following that, we have our input trim control, and this is going to be our input level. Now, you're not going to see this in most DAWs, because in most DAWs, the sound is already at line level when it gets there. But a mixing board like this starts with a microphone preamp, which is this section right here. And we can use this to set levels, just like you do on your audio interface when recording. After the mic pre section, we have another section of the mixing board we can't see from the top, and that's the insert section. And the insert section allows us to add external devices into the signal flow. So we might want to use this mic pre to bring the level up to line level, then send the signal out of the device to another effect, like a compressor EQ, and then bring it back into the channel strip. To do this, we use a special kind of cable called an insert cable. And though we're seeing three things, this is actually showing one side and the other side of the cable. In that the first side of the cable is a TRS cable, which we saw earlier was a tip, ring, and sleeve cable. And this plugs into the mixing board in the back, into the insert section. The sound goes out one side of the cable and comes back in on another. So it's like you have the TRS that splits out into the two TSs and is designed to create kind of a loop that can go out of your computer, or I'm sorry, out of the mixer into a device and then back in, effectively allowing you to insert a third party piece of gear like a compressor EQ into the mixing board. And we'll see inserts will play a major role within our DAW later as well. After the insert, we move on to this series of knobs. Going down, we see the aux sends. Now, this is one of those places where it's kind of out of order, in that these aux sends aren't necessarily here. But an aux send is a separate output for the track. We typically think of a track having an output on the very bottom, maybe going to your headphones, but very often you'd like a track to go to two places. And the aux sends, which stands for auxiliary sends or additional sends, allow you to route a track to more than one place. And if you look at a row of aux sends, it functions kind of like a secondary mix, in that we have one mix that's the faders at the bottom, but another mix that's the row of aux sends, and then another mix that's the second row of aux sends. Very useful, and we'll look later in this week at a couple different uses for auxiliary sends. On this mixing board, we have an EQ section next, which allows us some general kind of spectral manipulation of the track. Now, this does not always exist on a DAW mixing board, in that a DAW mixing board would rely on inserts for all of those sorts of controls. After that, we have a pan knob, and again, this is a place where the mixing board top to bottom signal flow is a little bit out of order, and that the pan knob is actually coming after the fader, but doesn't really matter. And the pan knob, all it really does is change the level between the two channels. So what we have here is actually a mono channel strip, in that there's a single input to the channel strip, but the output of the channel strip is stereo. And that's very common. It really is. Anytime you have a mono track, the input is mono, but the output will always be stereo. And all this pan knob is doing is controlling the relative levels. If I pan it to the right, we're going to hear the sound out of the right speaker and not hear it in the left speaker at all. If I pan it to the left, we'll hear it out of the left speaker and not in the right speaker at all. So all it's really doing is adjusting two levels. It's as if you had two faders, one for the right channel and one for the left. Before we go on, I'd like to talk a little bit more about panning. So we've looked at it on a mono-channel strip, but panning becomes much more complicated on a stereo channel strip, which is what you have in the DAW often. And the thing to remember about a pan knob is it doesn't take information from one side and move it to the other side. All it does is reduce two levels. So if you have a track that's already stereo and you pan to the right, it's never going to take the left information and move it to the right. It'll just reduce the left side, or reduce the information that's on the left-hand side. We'll talk about that a little more later. After the pan knob, we have our mute buttons, which just turn off the sound of that track. And then our solo, which isolates that track by itself, muting all the other tracks. Now this is where your DAW might function a little different from someone else's, in that how the solo buttons react. Sometimes in a DAW you turn one solo button on and all the others automatically turn off. And in some DAWs are like this mixing board in which you can have multiple solo buttons selected at once, kind of creating just a set of mutes for the mixing board. So it's something you might want to investigate in your DAW and just see exactly how those solo buttons work. After the solo buttons, we really have the most important part of our mixing board, which is our volume faders, our main faders. And these, on an analog mixing board, will often have a U, or unity gain section, which will not amplify or attenuate the signal. It's as if what's coming into it is going out of it. And again, we want to keep things at unity kind of as much as possible. Now, we'll see that this channel strip repeats over and over. It's the same thing. So all the things we just learned on that channel strip apply all the way across the mixing board, and you have a set of faders that really does create your whole mix. That set of faders gets combined. The output of all those tracks get combined on our master bus, which is right here. Now, the idea of a bus is hugely important, and we're going to explore that more throughout the DAW, but we have our main master bus right here. And you really can call this our master section, and in a DAW, it would be the master fader track would supply most of the functionality of this section. Luckily, we have a row of LEDs above this, which will give us our level setting feedback, in that as I'm setting the trim for all my tracks, I can set them based on this, and I can also see the level of the entire mix. And again, remember to keep things in the green, peaking in the yellow, and never touching the red, right? Red means stop. It's pretty self-explanatory there. All right, now that we've seen what a mixing board looks like in the analog domain and the real world here, we're going to start taking this information and applying it into the DAW. It's largely the same, but there are some differences. Now we'll move into our DAW and start examining a channel strip there and just figure out the main components of a channel strip. Like we did in the analog domain, we'll now try to apply that information into your DAW. I'd like you to have your piece of software open and running alongside this video so you can find these pieces and kind of follow along in your piece of software. The first thing we need to do is locate the track inputs and outputs, or the channel strip's inputs and outputs. We largely configure our signal flow by choosing drop-down menus. We'll choose what the track is listening to, or where it's getting its signal from, and where the signal is going to. On the same step, I'd like you to locate the track name. Can you name a track, and how do we see it here in your DAW? The next thing we want to be aware of is where can a track send its information to. So in that case, we'll look at the track outputs. Now typically there are two possible kinds of outputs. We can route the sound from the track down to hardware outputs, so we can hear them in our headphones or on our main speakers, or we can route sounds up to buses. And a bus is a place to kind of collect and route sound within the computer, and we'll be talking more about that during this week. The next thing we want to consider is the direction of the signal flow. So we can see that the sound will go out outputs and will enter through an input. So we want to start really considering kind of getting a mental model of the mixing board and how the signal is flowing through it, even though we don't have cables to plug in like we do in the analog domain. The next thing we'll find in our channel strip are going to be the inserts. And the inserts are a collection of places that we can add effects, like gates, compressors, EQs, that sort of thing. The next thing we'll find in our signal flow are our sends. And this is going to be the tricky part of the signal flow, in that any particular send can exist in two places, before the fader or after the fader, pre-fader or post-fader, and we'll talk about that in great detail this week. We just want to know that we have a send section in our mixing board. It will always have a send destination where we're sending that information to. That will usually be a bus or a hardware output. We'll have a send level, how much signal is going to that output, and usually there'll be a button for pre or post, which controls where that send lives inside of the signal flow. From there, you're going to have your volume and pan. Your pan knob controls the output of the signal in the left or the right channel, and the volume controls the main output volume of the channel. That is the basic signal flow through a DAW. I hope you were able to find all these individual components in your DAW. If you weren't able to find every one of these specifics in your piece of software, I would suggest moving to the forums or doing some searching, going through the manual, locating all these pieces. You'll need to know how to manipulate these parts of the channel strip in your DAW.